and negative. That is the process of learning. So today we have such an interesting topic, and our topic is food and nutrition. Under it, we shall look at food poisoning. But before we get deep into our lesson today, there is what we call a prerequisite knowledge that you should have on your fingertips as far as science is concerned. And this is about around 4 things. Number 1, we ask ourselves, what is food? What is food? From the Oxford Dictionary, basically we define food as a substance, a nutritious substance that we consume. Not to consume means to either eat or you drink. So these substances, we consume them in order to remain healthy, in order to have life and to grow. When we talk of nutritious substances, then this in class 5, they are mainly classified into 3. We have the bodybuilding foods, which call proteins. We have vitamins, protective foods, and we have carbohydrates, energy-giving foods. So those are under what you call the nutrients. So these nutrients are the ones that we absorb in our body, and they are very helpful. Having understood what food is, the substances in it, then it's okay if we look at the meaning of the word nutrition. So the process of providing the body with the required necessary nutrients is what we call nutrition. In our syllabus, we also have the word nutritionist. So you get nutritionist. So nutritionist basically is the person who now will recommend on how which nutrients are needed in your body. And remember, in class 8, we have special people who need special diet. Having talked about food, nutrients, nutrition, and nutritionist, we'll go deeper into our lesson. Please note, these are some of the words that you'll hear me pronounce as we proceed on with our lesson. Talking of food poisoning, and we have the process of giving food, required nutrients in your body, then there's something that is very paramount, and is what you call a balanced diet. Balanced diet. We are advised to make sure that every time we sit down to take a meal, the meal should be balanced. And the balanced diet comes from the nutrients, the bodybuilding, the energy giving, and the protective foods that we talked about. Now, when you talk of food poisoning as our subtopic today, we are looking at 2 words, the food that we had defined, and poisoning, the process. So something poisonous, basically it means something harmful. I like our nutrients that were helpful, then this one is harmful. Now, what is food poisoning? We define food poisoning as an illness. Illness. Some books will talk of sickness. Illness or sickness. Now, this one is as a result of harmful substances found in the food. As we consume food, there might be some harmful substances in it that will cause illness in us. Remember, our 3 main objectives, as I stated earlier, are, number 1, we're able to define some of these terms that are listed here as far as food poisoning is concerned. Number two, you'll be able to acquire some skills, like as simple as the good hygienic skills that we should inquire as far as handling of food is concerned. Then having the knowledge, having the desired skills, then definitely we'll have the right attitude, and that will help us to avoid or avert some of these challenges. So food poisoning, illness, sickness, and it's a result of harmful substances found in the food that we consume. Now, our syllabus advises us to get to know the agents of poisoning. How does this happen? So, we look at agents of food poisoning. So as per the syllabus, we look at two main agents of food poisoning. And the first one, we have what you call chemicals. Now, I know you're wondering, what are chemicals doing at home? And I'm here to let you know that some of the chemicals that are commonly used at home can cause food poisoning if they are handled carelessly, especially where food is concerned. So we list a few of them. So some of these chemicals found at home, we shall list a few. Number one, we have insecticides. Insecticides. So insecticides, we all know that are chemicals used to kill insects at home. So these insecticides, if they find their way where the food is, then definitely that food, if consumed, will be poisonous and it can lead to food poisoning. And remember, we said food poisoning basically is the illness or sickness that is harmful to our body when we consume food that has been contaminated. Number two, example of chemicals, we talk to pesticides. While insecticides are chemicals used to deal with insects, then pesticides, from the word pesticides, you get the word pests. So these are basically chemicals that are used to control pests. So these are some of the chemicals that are found at home. Let's keep on going. Number three, we shall have herbicides. Herbicides are also some of the chemicals that are used at home, found at home, that when they find their way to on food, then we consume that food, and then that can lead to food poisoning. Soaps are some of other chemicals that we have at home. Detergents. Come to think of it, boys and girls, when you go for shopping and you've shopped foodstuffs and you also shopped some of these chemicals for the purposes that I've listed, you'll realize that when they're helping you to pack, they'll deliberately make sure that they pack foodstuff differently from these chemicals. This basically is just to avoid the fact that if they find their way to the food that we consume, then definitely they'll lead to food poisoning. On the same note, we have things like paints. Also, some of the chemicals found at home, and if they find their way into the food, then definitely we shall experience food poisoning. We also have kerosene. Some books will refer to it as paraffin. Basically, these are some of the chemicals found at home. Now, these, basically, if you look at them, they're artificial. But there are instances, boys and girls, where you find that naturally there are some toxins that are produced naturally in the food that can lead to food poisoning. So we shall look at some of them, and we look at, for instance, if grains, in this case let's use maize, is stored in a damp place, and maybe it was not completely dried, then after some times you'll able to, if you observe it, you'll see some bluish color in it. Okay, that is naturally, that is an example where naturally the grains has produced some toxins that can lead to food poisoning. So we talked of grains. There is a term that is used rarely, but you can find it, especially when you're looking at the final exams, that is the KCP. The term is aflatoxin. Rarely, but they can throw in that term. Now, this basically as a result of grains and especially maize having kind of moldy aspect, and definitely that is a natural occurrence. So it has naturally released that. If that is consumed, then definitely we will have the issue of food poisoning. Secondly, you've heard of maybe in news announcing that a certain part of our world ate a certain tuber, for example cassava, and some of the parts, they are highly poisonous. So some tubers, especially what I've heard, cassava, definitely they have naturally toxins that can be poisonous if consumed. We shall look at later on issues of what are some of the symptoms that you can observe so that you can ascertain if the food is poisonous or someone is suffering from food poisoning. Boys and girls, remember our topic is about food and nutrition, and our subtopic is food poisoning. We've defined what food is, nutritious substances that we consume. Consume in this case means we eat or we drink that are harmful, keyword harmful. Number two, we talked of agents of food poisoning. We just looked at one, some of the chemicals that are commonly found at home. The word is commonly found at home. So we talked of insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, soaps, detergents, paints, kerosene, and paraffin. We've gone ahead and said that when these are artificial, some are natural. So the natural chemicals, the toxins, we've listed instances like grains not well stored, maybe damp, maybe not completely dried before storing. Then they lead to that word that we've used there, aflatoxin. For example, maize. We talked of some tubers. In this case, we've used cassava tubers. Some parts are highly poisonous. The third one, I know you've heard of people complaining of stomachache, bloating. It can even go to vomiting after eating beans. Basically, the remedy will be, if you want to boil beans tomorrow, you are advised to soak it overnight. Then that water that you've soaked in, you remove, and when you're boiling, you boil with fresh, clean water. That will help to minimize some complaints that you'll have after you've eaten beans. We've named them, such as stomach aches, we've talked of bloating, vomiting, and so forth. The fourth thing is, if you've observed keenly sweet potato, yes, no, Irish potatoes. If you observed Irish potatoes, the Irish potatoes, sometimes the Irish potatoes, if not well stored, they will sprout. The word that I'm using here is sprout. And you'll find some green things growing or parts of the potatoes. Now, you are not supposed to take that because that is a recipe for food poisoning. So if you happen to store your Irish potatoes in particular, and you find that there are some parts that are sprouting and they're green in color, the remedy, if you need to take it, then make sure you completely cut it off. But my advice will be avoid, because that will be a good recipe for food poisoning. So we've talked of chemicals, artificial and the natural toxins that are produced from different foods that we consume. I told you that we have two agents. So number one, talked of chemicals. How about number two? We talked of microorganisms. Microorganisms. From the word micro, I'm sure something like microscopic rings on your mind, which these are tiny organisms. Basically, we talk of such as bacteria that get into the alimentary canal. When we talk about alimentary canal, your brains goes back to grade 5, where you talked of, actually that's the beginning of human systems, body systems. And you talked of the alimentary canal, the tract, all the way from the mouth to the anus. So if that is invested with microorganisms, then definitely, like bacteria, then definitely you'll have cases or scenario of having consumed poisonous food that will lead to food poisoning. So how do they get into the alimentary canal? Definitely through contaminated food that has been exposed to these harmful agents, and if it is consumed. Definitely they have the ability to multiply, and when they multiply, they will produce toxins that will cause abdominal pains. Number two, we've talked of some protein foods, and like meat pies. So if meat pies or other things like ice creams, if are not well stored, then they provide a conducive environment, a favorable environment. Those words can be used interchangeably as far as our subtopic is concerned. They can make a favorable, conducive environment for bacteria to grow and multiply. Please note, if they grow and they multiply and it is happening in your digestive tract, then definitely will have some repercussions that are not good. Similarly, under the microorganisms, if food, for example, is not stored, let's just use a piece of bread. If not well stored, then definitely you realize that there are some molds. We talk of molds growing on it. Your brains go back to grade 5 under classification of plants. So molds will be under non-green plants, what you call fungus. So they grow. Definitely if you consume that bread, then you'll be a candidate of food poisoning. Now, boys and girls, having talked of food poisoning as our subtopic, talked of chemicals and microorganisms are agents of food poisoners. Food poisoning, how will you know that someone is suffering from food poisoning? Now, we talked of signs and symptoms. Some books will use those two words interchangeably, but I'm here to clarify that symptoms basically are feelings, sensations. That's why when you go to a doctor, you'll say, doctor will ask you how you feeling. Oh, I'm feeling fever, or such kind of things. Those are basically the symptoms that we're going to look at as far as food poisoning is concerned. And we have signs. Signs, basically, boys and girls, are observable characteristics. So for us here, we shall work with symptoms. So let's talk about symptoms of food poisoning. Symptoms of food poisoning. Now, the following are basic symptoms of food poisoning that we can look at. Number one, we'll talk of vomiting. And this vomiting is not just normal, let me put in bracket, in quotes, not normal, we talk of violent. And you know, when it is violent, then your body is losing water, what we call dehydration. So if if it happens, then you need to seek immediate medical attention. Number two, we have severe stomachache. Severe stomachache is a second symptom of food poisoning, where you feel intense pain, acute pain in your abdominals. Number three, we can have diarrhea. As the third symptom of food poisoning. Remember, boys and girls, I've said symptoms are feelings or sensations that a person will experience when he or she is undergoing different thing, in this case, food poisoning. We also have fever. Number five, we can also talk of feeling weak. Check the spelling of weak. And dizziness. Those are some of the symptoms that one may show while he or she is experiencing food poisoning. Now, having talked of food poisonings as our subtopic, having talked of food and nutrition as under food and nutrition, and you talked of agents of food poisoning, whereby you mentioned chemicals, and you also mentioned microorganisms, and you talked of now symptoms, the sensations that one may feel when he or she is experiencing food poisoning. Is a good thing for us to talk of ways of preventing food poisoning. At this particular point in time, people indulge in eating healthy. So we have to be hands-on to ensure that we prevent cases or instances of food poisoning. And basically, boys and girls, we're going to look at the unhygienic practices of handling food that can lead to food contamination and hence food poisoning. And up there, we talked of favorable conditions or conducive conditions for growth of microorganisms, and we are looking at warmth, dirt, moisture, and definitely darkness. So we shall focus mainly on the positive or the good food hygienic practices. So if we capture the good food hygienic practices, then definitely we will live or consume food that is free from the agents of food poisoning. So let's talk about the food hygienic practices. Food hygienic practices. And number one, we should store food properly under right conditions. Storing of food properly under right conditions. So I'll pick the word right conditions as far as food storage is concerned. So remember up there we talked of favorable, conducive environment or conditions where bacteria can grow, that is warmth, dirt, moisture, darkness. So if we avoid that, then we will have stored the food under right conditions. Number two, when you go to purchase food, make sure that you purchase food from clean stores, whether kiosks, whether food vendors, marketplaces. Make sure that place is clean. All right. then once you buy it, then the good thing to do is to also ensure that you are buying fresh products, especially, boys and girls, especially when you talk of fruits and vegetables. Make sure they are fresh. Someone may ask me, but I need to buy, for instance, mangoes, but they're not in season. So it's advised, if you're getting fruits especially, get a fruit that is in season. Because the one that is out of season, then if not well stored, then definitely will lead to food poisoning. Another very important thing is checking the expiry date. How many of us here get to a supermarket, or how many of us here get to a supermarket and before they buy any product, especially these fast foods, for instance, how many of us just check the expiry date? Remember, even if you, especially the canned food, make sure you check the expiry date. If you happen to buy a canned meat, for instance, and it's expired, even if you put all the spices in the world, they still lead to food poisoning because it has already expired. So check expiry date while purchasing food. We talked of when you purchase, maybe you're in a supermarket or a store or a mall or somewhere, you'll see people make those guys helping you to sort, that's the word, the food from chemicals. Same thing when you reach home, ensure that chemicals are stored away. Chemicals are stored away from foods. And if you talk of chemicals, boys and girls, then your mind goes back to the list of chemicals that we had listed here, including pesticides, herbicides, we talked of soaps, detergents. So we make sure that they're stored differently, separately from foods. And that will help us to avoid contaminating food. Next, we've talked of washing fruits and vegetables, especially those that are eaten raw. Raw foods. Before you consume, and this word consume, remember I've told you is to eat or to drink. In this case, we're talking of raw foods. Foods that are eaten without preparation in terms of cooking. Make sure, boys and girls, they are thoroughly. The key word here is thoroughly. Thoroughly means you wash with running water, okay, before you consume. That will have helped to avoid microorganisms that are on it to affect your alimentary canal or your digestive system. Where we store food, as number 7, where we store food, we are now dealing with right conditions. So where we store food, make sure it is dry, make sure we have enough air circulation, because if not, remember we talked of the word that I used, aflatoxin, remember? Yes, remember we talked of that. So make sure it is dry, it's clean, air circulation is well, to avoid food going bad in our stores. Next, there's sometimes you cook food and is not consumed. Everything is not consumed. So food leftovers, boys and girls, food leftovers. So food leftover must be well stored, but before that, ensure that it has cooled completely before you store it. And definitely, when you're storing, then you think of a refrigerator, or let's use a refrigerator. Now, do you know, boys and girls, that you should know what should come on which shelf inside a refrigerator, so that you avoid contamination inside the refrigerator. So we said food leftovers should be cooled completely before storage. And if you need now to consume it, then number 9, you should properly, keyword, reheat. Properly reheat. Remember, where there is, when we heat it properly, then the microorganisms, the bacteria, can't survive. But if you haphazardly reheat it, then you will be exposing yourself to food poisoning. How about those foods that are in our freezer? So if you need to prepare them, number 10, boys and girls, then the key word is there is thaw. Make sure that you thaw them thoroughly before you use them. Thaw them thoroughly before we use them. Now, in the process of preparing food in the kitchen, as number 11, then you have some books will say kitchen refuse, some books will say kitchen waste, like peels and so on. When you're preparing food, ensure that the kitchen refuse, kitchen waste are away from foods. They are away. For example, the peels. You peeled a tomato, or you're using onions and so on. Make sure the peels are definitely far away from the food that you're preparing, and that will help us to avoid the issue of food poisoning. So, boys and girls, some of these things are things that are practical, hands-on, that you can help or do at home, especially this time. Now, having all this knowledge compounded by the good attitude, the right attitude to do the right thing, just because you are hungry doesn't mean you do not wash your fruits and veggies, especially those consumed raw, hurriedly. You should make sure that that is done well, and the word that we used is thoroughly. So I encourage you that as you consume this food at home, make sure you've practiced some of these good hygienic practices as far as food is concerned. Remember, we were talking about food and nutrition. It's a class 8 topic, science class 8 topic, and under it we talked about food poisoning. We said food poisoning is poisoning is definitely an illness. Food poisoning is definitely an illness or sickness that is resulted as a result of consuming harmful substances that are found in food. Then we talked of agents of food poisoning, boys and girls. We talked of 2. We talked of chemicals, and we talked of microorganisms. The chemicals basically are things that are commonly used, chemicals commonly used at home: insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, soaps, detergents. And we said that sometimes naturally, they can occur naturally. The toxins can occur naturally. And we've looked at 3 main things. We talked of maize that is not well dried or placed in a dampy place, that will have aflatoxin. We talked of some tubers, for example, cassava, that will definitely have some parts of it are highly poisonous. We also talked of moldy fruits, green or sprouting parts of potatoes, especially the Irish potatoes. Completely cut them out. We had also a remedy for bloating, stomachache, and even vomiting when one consumes beans, and you said you should soak it overnight and then drain away that water and boil it with fresh water. From there, we talked of microorganisms also causing food poisoning that are taken into the body through consuming food that is poisonous, and they attack the alimentary canal, they multiply, and they can lead to abdominal pains. And we talked of symptoms of food poisoning. We listed a few. We talked of violent vomiting, and I remember insisting on the issue of dehydration. So this is one of the ways where our body loses water. and you know how important water is in our body. Stomach aches, severe stomach aches. We also talked of diarrhea, fever, feeling weak, and dizziness. So if this happens, then the first thing is seek medical attention as fast as possible. Then we also talked of ways of preventing food poisoning, and we talked of basically the positive good food hygiene practices, all the way from the storage. Make sure they're stored under right conditions. When you're purchasing, make sure where you purchase it from, the stalls, the kiosks, the food vendors, is clean. Then purchase fresh fruits and vegetables. And if possible, go for fruits that are in season. We talked of expiry date. From now henceforth, I want every girl and boy is listening and watching that every time you get to a place that you need to buy, make sure you check the expiry date. The chemicals that we talked about, make sure they're stored differently from foodstuffs. Foods eaten raw, the key word was thoroughly wash them with running water. Properly reheat any leftover before you consume it. And if you are storing any leftover, make sure it is completely cooled before you store. And we talked of frozen foods that should thaw before you consume. Now, boys and girls, this topic and the subtopic under it is very important in our day-to-day lives. So I'm posing a challenge to you. As we proceed on with the sessions, I need you to discuss various food hygiene practices that will help to guard against food poisoning at home. Apart from this, what are other ways, what are other good food hygienic practices that we can use, that you can customize in your place to avoid food poisoning? Now, some of the questions that can be asked in an exam setup, and I'll draw your attention to the just concluded KCP, question 2021, question 2022, question 33. There was a question on bodybuilding foods. Remember when I was starting the topic, we talked of foods and we talked of nutrients, and we mentioned three: the bodybuilding. We also mentioned the energy giving and the protective. So there's a question on the same on the bodybuilding. So they were looking for protein. We also, from this topic, to just show the essence of us learning, the rationale as to why we should learn this, apart from practicing at home, we also expect questions on the same. And question 35 of just concluded KCP 2022 was about, under this, about lactating mothers. Lactating mothers, what they should eat and how they should eat. So you can see the essence, the rationale, the reason as to why we learn these very vital topics and subtopics in our day-to-day life. Now, to wind up the lesson, we have discussed about three main things. We have defined what food poisoning is, and we've talked of illness or sickness resulted of consuming harmful substances, and we've talked of eating or drinking, and this one from food. We have mentioned the importance or the agents of food poisoning, chemicals and microorganisms. We have also mentioned symptoms of food poisoning, and I've said clearly that symptoms are feelings, are sensations, and they're different from signs, because signs are observable characteristics, all the way from violent diarrhea, severe stomachache, vomiting, fever, feeling weak and dizzy. And we've talked of the food hygienic practices that we should practice. So as we wind up our session today, please take note of the keywords that I have mentioned. The keywords that I have mentioned. I have mentioned keywords like food, nutritious, nutrients, nutrition, nutritionist, illness, sickness, agents, and microorganisms, and hygienic food, hygienic practices. So these are words that are used in setting of our exam. And on that note, boys and girls, our lesson comes to the end. I wish you a good afternoon. Thank you.
Sasa ni bora zaidi. Mwanzo mpya, mambo mapya. Msimu mwingine wa Boresha Kilimo unakuletea teknolojia ibuka, kilimo mseto, uongezaji thamani. Teknolojia dijitali ya mauzo inawezesha ufikiaji wa masoko. Sokomoko yako, mahangaiko yako ya kufikia masoko yamefika kikomo, manake tunao Mkulima Young.
What Mkulima Young does is it connects farmers with the market.
Hii ni Boresha Kilimo kwa ushirikiano na Mkulima Young. Atafutaye hachoki na kichoka kesha pata.